Speaking with us this morning is Mindy Belz. She is a senior editor at World News Group and the author of the book, They Say We Are Infidels, subtitled On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Writing for World since 1986, she has covered war in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans, and has served as the World Magazine editor for 11 years. The notes for her lecture, A Biblical View and Reaction to ISIS, are on page 55. Please join me in welcoming Mindy Belz.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me? Am I on? We'll give everything a second to get in gear here. Is it okay? So you have notes about my lecture. Did I write those notes? I've forgotten. Oh, good. Okay, so I can talk about whatever I want to. Pardon me while I just get situated. You're going to take charge of my purse. Yes, ma'am. Just put it over there by the wall. Thank you. It's great to be here. I've spoken several times to the Summit Adult Conferences, and all the while I was dreaming of being with you. And it's also great to be back. I'm just about 48 hours back from a really crazy trip across Europe, interviewing refugees from the Atlantic to the Aegean. And so I'm at the moment having been about plus 3 hours GMT. I'm to, I think, minus 7 or 8 hours Greenwich Mean Time. So forgive me if I forget my name or something. Okay. So you get to do the zoo and climbing and laser tag today, but first you have to do ISIS and terrorism and persecution. I often feel like, yeah, thanks. I often feel like Jeremiah, I should come in weeping and in sackcloth and ashes to bring this kind of talk. But I want to tell you, the book that I wrote about Christians suffering under Islamic terrorism and being forced out of Iraq and Syria, it came out in April, and I have been speaking a lot on this topic, both before but especially since. And just when I think I can't do it again, I get energized, because here's why, very specific reason. I think we're all seeing that this is a threat that is growing and not being contained. It is a threat that affects not only exotic places, but now we see it affecting places that we're very familiar with. If you saw images this week, and I saw them in real life, soldiers not only in camo and with a handgun and a rifle, but soldiers with automatic weapons and Kevlar vests and riot gear standing guard at the Eiffel Tower. Who knew? This is the world that you would be coming to live in and to work and to be productive in. It is, and yet here's the thing. If we look at, say, Hebrews 11 and 12, that long list of what Christians have suffered, a list that we can look at and we can just draw the parallels down through the ages, people who were stoned, people who were sawn in two, some of the worst kinds of atrocities you can imagine. And then we get to the end of that, and there's a grand purpose for it. And I want to begin with that purpose. It's they were people of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. That is the testimony that they were handing down to us, and that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So I want to begin there with us thinking of how the saints through the ages can be and are being made perfect, and how we are being made perfect through the suffering of God's people. I'm not a great multitasker, so we'll just do our best. If I forget to change a slide, I hope somebody will signal me. These are pictures from Iraq and from the coming of ISIS into Iraq that began in 2014. What I want you to think about now in 2016 is this. The people who for 2 years have been subject to ISIS, have been living in cities that were captured by ISIS, like Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, or Fallujah, the Sunni heartland of Iraq. They have been whispering. We've heard this from those who have now been released after the Iraqi army retook Fallujah just in the last month or 6 weeks from ISIS. The people came out and they said, "We have been whispering for 2 years because we were so afraid." They've been whispering in their homes to their children, to their spouses, to their aging parents who are living with them. That's the kind of fear that they were living in. They were afraid that any kind of infraction, major or minor, would bring them to the attention of ISIS, and they did not want the Islamic State fighters coming into their homes, knocking on their doors. That's the level of fear. And yet, at the same time, and I think this is the belief that they began on, they began thinking that they could live with these terrorists, thinking that, and a belief that, we have seen magnified in the West, thinking that there was an accommodation to be reached with them. And yet they've been reduced to something that I would call subhuman. In fact, I would argue that we here in the United States would not allow our pets or our livestock to be treated the way that they have been treated. So first I want to go back a little bit, and I want to talk about, first of all, let's do a little background and talk about ISIS and how this movement came to be what it is. The experts say that ISIS is the fourth wave of Islamic jihadi terrorism. And let's go through just real quickly what some of those are. Well, there we go. Oops, sorry. That's as they came into the streets of Mosul, and you can see that they're being cheered by some of the people there. That was in June of 2014. But here, let's recap this so that we understand where we are. The first wave would be the Al-Qaeda wave that grew up in the 1980s under the so-called Afghan Arabs who collected in Afghanistan to fight the occupation of the Soviets' occupation of Afghanistan. These were well-educated, well-financed. If you think about the bin Laden family, they were from wealthy Saudi and other families. They were not primarily Afghans, but some of them were. The current leader of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is an Afghan. And then we come to the second wave. But in between there, this is a wave that the United States, if you remember, was very unaware of. In fact, the CIA was actually helping to finance these Arab Afghans and give them arms because we wanted them to beat the Soviets. We were still in a Cold War way of thinking. In 1996, Osama bin Laden declared war on America. Were any of you born then? I do need to get a read on. Yeah, okay. So in 1996, so think about that. He declared war on America. None of us in America were really aware of that. I actually was making a trip to Sudan, I think in 1998. And before I went, a friend who's very astute in these things handed me a book and said, you need to read this book on the plane. It was a biography of Osama bin Laden, but it had been written by someone who had actually been in Afghanistan and had seen how these Arab Afghans fought, and who recognized the threat that they actually posed to the West. It was the first biography of Osama bin Laden, and it came out at a time when nobody was really paying attention to him. So then we come forward to the event that made us all pay attention. What was that? 9/11. And with 9/11, we saw, and I should back up and just say this, that I read this book on the plane, and I was shocked by the organization and the philosophical depth of this man, Osama bin Laden, and shocked by the lethal threat that he posed. And then while I was in southern Sudan, which at that time was itself under the grip of Islamic jihadi war, you had an Islamic regime based in the north fighting against a rebel army in the south that was primarily composed of Christians. And I went village to village and saw how lethal this threat was, how they were torching the villages, chasing people out. I watched a young girl of about 2 who really looked like a bird. She was so emaciated. I watched her die on a blanket. Those were the kinds of conditions that people were forced to live in. And we passed at one point just south of one of bin Laden's training camps. It had just been closed, and as we know now, bin Laden had moved and headquartered al-Qaeda in Afghanistan at that time, or re-headquartered it there, I should say. So few of us were really tracking with how lethal this threat was until 9/11. And then we come to what I'll call the second wave. Not what I'll call, what other people call the second wave. And that is when bin Laden basically recruited expatriates, including some from the West. Many of them had come to school in the United States, and they felt disconnected by Western culture. They saw what was excessive and what was sort of un-Islamic about Western culture. They felt marginalized. At home, they had no prospects for jobs, and in the West, they felt they had no cultural prospects. And bin Laden capitalized on that. And he recruited this generation of young men who traveled to the training camps of Afghanistan and prepared for 9/11. In 2002, after 9/11, I made my first trip to Iraq. I went in through the north because I had heard from too many reporters and other people that if I flew into Baghdad, I would, stepping off the plane, have someone attached to me from the Ministry of Information and basically be followed around by Saddam Hussein the whole time, and all my movement watched and carefully restricted. So I wanted to see more of what was happening in the north, more of what was happening with the Kurds, who were separated from Iraq at that time by, this gets really complicated. The United States and Britain were carrying out a no-fly zone over the north to protect the Kurds. What that meant was their economy was separate and their security was separate from Saddam Hussein. I wanted to see what that looked like. What I didn't count on when I got there, someone said, "Would you like to interview one of the terrorists we've caught?" And I said, "Well, of course, but tell me more." These were jihadists from a group called Ansar al-Islam. And this guy sketched out for me the training camp where he had trained in Afghanistan. He pointed out where Osama bin Laden's house was. And these things have all since been verified and are pretty much established knowledge. It was one of the main camps that Osama bin Laden was using. This guy had been recruited, had trained there for 2 years, and was coming back across Iran and forming up this group at the border between Iran and Iraq called Ansar al-Islam. They're kind of a hideout, kind of the headquarters they had established there at the border, was the first thing that the United States attacked. when we started the war in Iraq. And so when you hear that there was no terrorist threat, and I would even argue there was no threat of weapons of mass destruction, when you hear that, which is a common prevailing wisdom now, that it was a mistake for us to go into Iraq, I think you can have an argument about whether it was wise or not. But the basis on which that statement is made is really based on ignoring the evidence, because there were terrorists. There was a steady stream of terrorists coming from Afghanistan into Iraq who had cover with Saddam Hussein. So at that time, they were there. We were not really, again, even though we were planning, even though 9/11 had happened, even though we were planning this war in Iraq, we were not fully appreciating the extent and the shape of this threat. So then that brings us to the third wave. The third wave sprang up after the war in Iraq began. And it was, and it's much more well known to us, we came to call it Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This was now what I would call an early forerunner of ISIS, of what we see now, of this more global jihadist movement. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had a very specific goal. It was to defeat the Western forces, the United States and its allies in Iraq. And it was also, importantly, to establish an Islamic radical regime there that meant taking out the government that we were trying to prop up. So that's why when you think, well, they were attacking Muslims and Christians, it's important to factor that in, that was part of their agenda. What I want to, if you have this idea, which a lot of us have and which I think our media has fed, if you have this idea of these movements as being something that is chaotic or guerrilla warfare or just angry people lashing out in lethal ways, I want to rid you of that notion, because in every wave, and especially in these last two waves of terrorism that we have seen, we are talking about jihadist leaders who have a well-formed philosophy about why they're fighting, who have established a real structure to their organization, and who have very specific targets and specific goals in what they're doing. So what we saw in Iraq, the terrorism, what we called the insurgency that kept us in Iraq for 9 years instead of maybe the 1 or 2 years that we had hoped to be there, is what we would call a leaderless jihad. It was a jihad that was so well identified, so well philosophically identified, that its leaders could recruit people from all kinds of places, and those people would know that they were meant to be in Iraq or Syria or one of those places, and they would know what they were meant to do, that they were meant to carry out car bombings, and they were meant to strap on suicide vests and walk into markets. They were meant to hide explosives in baby carriages and go into fruit markets on a busy shopping day and blow 100 people up. And again, so many pictures of how we in the West were underestimating, or I think misestimating, who these people were and what they were doing. In 2008, I made a trip to Iraq. I was going almost on a yearly basis at that time. And my goal in going, if you remember your history at that time, in 2007, we had begun what was called the surge, where, against a lot of anti-war sentiment, the Bush administration, with Congress's kind of reluctant agreement, put more soldiers into Iraq. And the result was that places became more secure. If you remember any images from that time, you saw American soldiers actually patrolling streets in Baghdad, going door to door, that kind of thing. It was risky, and it was working. And I went primarily to see how it was working and to see what it looked like for people, for the Iraqis. And I went into Mosul, and what I didn't realize is that it was just working in a few places. And it turned out in 2008 that more Iraqi civilians were killed than any other year of the war. 17,000. 17,000 Iraqi civilians. And so as I began talking to people about traveling to Mosul, they said, you'll have to have an armed escort, you'll have to go to this building and that building, you won't be able to go to this part of the city. Mosul was a very diverse city. It had a provincial council made up of Kurds and Christians who were Orthodox and Chaldean and evangelical. It had Sunnis and it had Shiites. And I was wanting to cover this amazing diversity and how well it was working. And yet I found out that 1/3 of that provincial council had been assassinated. And that the city was a much more dangerous place. And we were not hearing these things here in the United States. We were hearing about how well the surge was working. And it left us unprepared for this. And that brings me to the fourth wave, and that would be the current wave that we are in. And that seeks to bring together, I would say it seeks to bring together all three of the previous waves. You have a highly trained, highly organized leadership class of Islamic State. They call themselves Islamic State, and of course we hear them referred to as ISIS, ISIL in Arabic. They're called Daesh. ISIS came in, and let me say this, the reason that I say it is a combination of all these three previous waves is that we know enough now about the leadership. And the leadership of ISIS is composed primarily of some of those jihadis from the third wave, including its current leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And it's also composed of a number, at least 30 at last count, former military and intelligence leaders under Saddam Hussein, including his number 2 man, who was a man who was long... Okay. Ibrahim al-Duri, who was Saddam's number 2, at one time his vice president. He was in that American deck of cards, but he was one of the few guys, actually, that we never caught. He is now rumored to be one of the leaders of ISIS and very heavily involved in its organization and strategic planning. We're not talking, again, about guerrilla warfare here, something that's hiding, waiting for a chance to break out. We're talking about a very organized outfit, and their goal is a different goal. It is perhaps an implicit goal of the earlier 3 waves of terrorism, but is now the explicit and stated goal. And that is to establish an Islamic caliphate in the Muslim world, the Middle East, and then to break that out from the Middle East into other parts of the world. And I want to emphasize how strategic that is. When was the last time you heard about an ISIS strike on Israel? Is it not surprising when you think about it? There hasn't been one. But ISIS has specifically said they're not interested in striking Israel right now because they have this initial goal. They want to establish dominion over Iraq, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and that Muslim heart of the Middle East. And then they plan to move out. And so, yes?
Was the attack in the cafe in Tel Aviv, was that not ISIS?
I think that someone did attribute it to ISIS, but I'm just saying that in their official documents, in their official social media magazines, what the proclamations they make, they have said they aren't interested in jihad against Israel right now. That could change like by noon today, because that's what we're dealing with. But that is their specific goal right now. Great question. So here we are. And this group that we thought we had vanquished in 2007 or 2008 or 2010 or 2011 when we pulled American soldiers out of Iraq, this group actually just bled back into the desert and then bled back into Syria, regrouped under the cover of Syria's civil war as rebel groups. And you think about that third wave, the way that third wave was so good at drawing people from all parts of the world, recruiting new jihadists with a clearly defined philosophy and clearly strategic goals, places to attack and kinds of attacks. That was honed to a new level using social media, using propaganda, connecting with, as we've heard stories now about how jihadists have been recruited in Europe. It's something that you guys will understand even better than someone my age, the way in which they have hooked up with even young women in Europe via Facebook and via Twitter and via other means. And then they began to build relationships, and then they began to encourage and entice them into serving in this movement. By doing that, there they were in Syria, and very strategically and very much in their own plan and very much not in the minds of the West, they attacked in Mosul in June of 2014. And here was one of the quick results, because the way that they came in, and you've probably heard a lot about this since then, so I won't spend a lot of time telling these kinds of stories, but the way that they came in was they came in overnight and in cover of darkness. They woke people out of bed. People were caught off guard, literally went door to door in streets in Mosul. I've talked to families who had knocks on their door and guns in their faces. They weren't even really awake. They had no idea what was happening. And they were told, they were given, the Christians were given three choices: convert to Islam. There was no time to think about it. It was there on the spot. Convert to Islam, stay on and pay a jizya. Do you know what that is? It's a tax. It's blackmail. It's an extortion fee. Stay on and pay jizya, or flee. And I think it's as I worked on the book, I became really convinced of how it's not a minor thing that this many people fled, because what Christians and Yazidis and others were saying is, we'll give up our houses, we'll give up our cars, or we'll give up our other belongings, but we won't give up the core of who we are. And for Christians, it was very much, we won't give up our faith. We will not deny who we are. And I think that that is a really unrecognized moment in our current history. And it's something that ought to draw us as Christians to this story, because there's so much for us to learn from it. So often when I talk about the persecuted church, I want to change the words. I mean, they are in fact persecuted, but I think we should also describe them as a persevering church. And this would be one of the reasons why, because at the point of a gun, in the middle of the night, on a split second, having to make a decision, the decision they did not make was the decision to capitulate. But what that meant was that they had to flee, and they fled by the thousands. Really, by August, 1.5 million there were 1.5 million Iraqis newly displaced by ISIS. And we saw the pictures, how they fled north, how they took up, how they were sleeping on the church pews because they didn't have anything else. And I just want you to look at this guy here on the front church pew. This is his life. This is what he brought with him and what he has now. He has a T-shirt or something rolled up under his head. He has a pair of shoes, and he has a small suitcase. Yes.
Did you take these photos?
Yes. And the wow, I don't want to get ahead of myself, sorry. And then in this picture, I did not take this one, but this is a picture of the flight. This flight continued through August. of 2014. In fact, just 2 years ago this week is when ISIS planted its black flag over the city of Sinjar, which is the heartland of the only Yazidi population, the only indigenous Yazidi population in the world. 400,000 Yazidis forced out of their homes. Sinjar being the largest city for Yazidis. And what I want you to notice in this picture is just the colorful diversity of the people who are fleeing. You have women in scarves who are clearly Muslims. If you look closely, you'll see some other women who are without head covering. Those would be Christians. The Yazidis tend to wear really colorful dresses. I actually think some of those women with the blue scarves in the front are probably Yazidis. They don't always wear them wrapped the same way that a Muslim woman would. But this is this is to me symbolic of the diversity of Iraq disappearing. And it is an ancient diversity that goes all the way back to the earliest civilizations. So over time, what we've seen where we are today is this 80% decline in the Christian population in Iraq, from 1.2 million before the US invasion to approximately, and you have to emphasize that these are rough numbers. There's been no census taken in Iraq since the 1980s. But I believe 200,000 is a pretty good number based on traveling among a lot of the churches in Iraq. That even now, because you continue to have people who are leaving, that's a daily, hourly business that's happening. But the largest segment of Iraq's Christians are displaced people now, and that's pretty significant. So here's a map that might look a little confusing, but I think the detail is worthwhile. The striking thing is, this map is about a year old, and in spite of what you see in the news, it hasn't changed that much. You can see that the red shows a line of ISIS-controlled areas. I would say, if you look at that red line running through Syria, that line now, it actually should be a shaded area moving up through that border with Turkey. I've been following a lot this week. There are a couple of villages up there along the Turkey-Syria border. I need a wand. I don't have one. Right up there at the top where you see it, it kind of is just a horizontal line. And it's truly significant to me because that area, those are some of the oldest churches in the world. I visited a church up there last year. There's a monastery called the Zaffron Monastery. You can look it up. And it's fascinating because the chapel of the church sits on top of an ancient Sumerian, I guess it would be, sun temple. And you can actually walk down under the chapel and see where the stones were aligned, and there was a crevice in the stones so that the sun would come in. And they worshipped in the temple at a specific time when the sun was slanting in through that window. You can see that. And then you know that there is this ancient church built on top of that, and then another current chapel built on top of that. These are the earliest evidence, I'll say, reality, but of Christianity as it spread out from the land of Judea, from Jerusalem, spreading east and spreading west. So what I want you to have this in mind because it helps make what I'm saying maybe a little bit less confusing. In 2002, go back to when I made that first trip to Iraq in 2002, how Iraq was a divided country. You could go in through Baghdad, or you could go in through the north. I had to get in a little boat and cross the Tigris River to go in through the north. What you could not do was travel from the south to the north. You could not get on a road in Baghdad and drive up to Iraqi Kurdistan. It was blocked by Saddam Hussein's Republican Army. Now, in 2016, we have essentially that situation again, because ISIS controls points all along that. If you look at that yellow line, and the red line stretches all the way down, further down than it's showing there, along the green toward the Iranian border. With ISIS essentially having, it is broken in a few places, but a largely unbroken 600-mile front there from the Syrian border to the Iranian border of Iraq. And so with just a few exceptions, you cannot, if you are an Iraqi, and keep in mind they've gotten used to now a decade of their country being one country, having a number of airlines, being able to get on the road and drive north to see relatives, or get on a plane and fly south to see someone in Baghdad. You can't do that now. I mean, actually, you can get on a plane. You cannot drive. If you are up there where it's green in that Kurdish area, and keep in mind that is where the Christians have fled and the Yazidis who have survived have fled, and a number of Muslims have fled. They're all living up there in that area that's in the green. And then the dotted areas down below Baghdad are where you have more displaced people living. But you cannot travel from Baghdad up to that green area without getting on a plane. So it is a divided country again. And more circumstances in which people are living. And what's really striking, and I think gets to the whole issue of how outsiders have responded, the lack of a coordinated international response to all of this has had tremendous repercussions, is that these are pictures that I took last year in March, April of 2015, and I've talked to people there since then, and most of the people I interviewed at that time, they're still living there. Their situations are very unchanged. It was supposed to be a hotel here on the left, a multi-story hotel that was going up on the outskirts of Erbil, which is the largest city in the north now. And instead, it was converted into housing for displaced people. And if you look closely, you'll see that what they did is they brought these like prefab containers, like we would see here used after a hurricane or something. They brought these prefab containers and they've just lined them up on these unfinished floors. Further out over on this side would be an open area, and lines of laundry were stretched out there. People had their laundry hanging out there. The time I was there, 180 families were living there. They were usually, and keep in mind that in this part of the world, a family can be anywhere from 6 to 12 people. A family is not 4 people. A family includes usually 3 or 4 or 5 children, and it includes grandparents and maybe some cousins. A number of the Yazidi families that I met there were not intact families. They were many. In fact, I would say most of them were missing a father. Sometimes missing multiple members of their family. And what's striking is that the Christians and the Yazidis were living together in that building and really learning about each other and helping each other. It was quite remarkable to see, even though you and I would probably not want to live, especially if you have young children. And that hall is very typical with laundry hanging along the wall. That's cooking equipment in that laundry basket, and the women were cooking out in the hall. There were no individual kitchen facilities. They would pull a burner out in and set hot water on top of it, or set a slab, an iron slab on top of it, and start making flatbread, that kind of thing. But what it was doing was it was bringing families together. It was really striking to see the women coming together around the cooking, and Yazidi and Christian women talking together and helping each other. This is another place that I visited at that same time. This would be in downtown Erbil. It was a shopping mall that, had a lot of features we would recognize, like escalators. But you went up to the 3rd floor, and they had turned all what had been office buildings into homes. And again, 2 families usually living in one room. It might be a large room, but by large I might mean the size of this area here to that column, maybe a little bit larger. And that would be, 12 to 15 people. Mattresses stacked up on one side, a little, an electric tea kettle for tea and things like that. Very meager. And that's the upstairs floor where many of them were living. And that's one of the gentlemen that I interviewed. His name is Najib Daniel. He's in his 70s. And his story is not that atypical. Najib and his wife were living in Karakosh, which was one of the towns that was overrun by ISIS, on about August 7th in 2014. Many people had fled to Karakosh thinking that it would be safe, and for a while it was under the protection of a Kurdish force. But ISIS began lobbing these 80-millimeter mortars and other weapons into the city. They actually succeeded in a bomb exploding in the middle of an area that killed 2 young boys and killed a woman who was supposed to be married that day. And that was obviously very frightening. Even the Kurdish forces pulled back at that point, and that exposed all these people who had come for refuge to Karakosh. And they began fleeing, and similar to the pictures that you saw there of the cars and all of those things. Najib and his wife, being older, were hoping to stay. And so when people said, "Come, we'll help you, let's get out of here," they said, "No, we'll stay. We're too weak to travel. This is our home." ISIS soldiers came in and actually occupied their home for about 14 days. And, if you go back to thinking about how people were whispering and people were gradually realizing what a frightful thing it was to live under ISIS, and this is what happened to them. And they began pleading to be let go and asking for a way of escape. And then one morning, the ISIS fighters who were occupying their home said, "It's time for you to get out. You have to go." And they ordered them out, and they ordered them to, and they were ordering out a number of other families who had stayed at the same time. These were Christians. And they ordered them to go and cross a river. They said, "You have to go this way." And that river was 10 miles away. And these people don't look like they're in great shape for a 10-mile walk, and they weren't. And Najib stepped in a hole and broke his leg at some point along the way. And he was hobbling. And one of the Dominican sisters who had come to help to see what was happening had come back into this area, helping these elderly and people with small children get out, these last to leave the city of Karakosh. She rounded up, I was told it was her nephew. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but that's what I was told. She rounded up a young man with a wheelbarrow, and he came in his wheelbarrow and put Najib in the wheelbarrow and took him down to the river. His wife actually made it on her own feet down to the river, and then the young man put him up on his shoulders and carried him across the river. And in that way, people were helping each other get to safety. This is another woman, 18-year-old, and she would be typical of many families, or her family would be typical of many families too. Her name is Nora. And Nora's family fled Mosul right as ISIS came in. If we go back to the map, so you can see where Mosul is marked. And so they're fleeing north into that green area. And they went to Karakosh first because they knew that it was under Kurdish control. But then again, it wasn't for very long, so they had to keep fleeing. And so by the time that they got into the north, which is where I met Nora, Nora had tried to commit suicide twice. She had been so frightened by her encounters with ISIS soldiers, and I imagine that they threatened her with rape and all kinds of things, because that is now documented that we know that's what they've done. And she had lost everything, and she just was so deeply, even as she talked to me, it was obvious how deeply grieved she was. She showed me that picture on her phone, And she said, "This is all I have left of my childhood. I found this photo on Facebook and I downloaded it to my phone so that I have it." And so, yeah, sorry. She said, "I miss my photographs." I said to her after we talked for a while, I said, "Tell me what it is you miss the most." And she said, "I miss my photographs from when I was little because everywhere in my house had a memory." And so I learned something from this conversation and have since seen it again just these last few weeks, hearing the stories of refugees who've now fled entirely and are living in refugee camps. You would be shocked to learn that there are refugee camps in downtown Brussels, downtown Athens, downtown Munich, downtown Berlin. And hearing their stories, what I think is hard for us to comprehend is that these families were forced out so quickly and so seemingly irrevocably that they, and especially if you can put yourselves in the place of someone who's an 18-year-old and you feel like you just lost your childhood. You just lost everything. I mean, think about that for a minute. You guys are all here from different places. You come and you have great opportunities to learn. You have a home somewhere that is rooting you, right? Even as you're here, you know that you're rooted. And when I've asked a few of you, "Where are you from?" you quickly can tell me where you're from. And if I asked you about your house and what your family was doing or your friends were doing right now, you quickly could tell me. What if you had none of that anymore? What if even asking that question, where are you from, brought up this horrible thing that had happened to you? And then they face this completely uncertain future. This situation now that for many of them still living in the upstairs shopping mall, still living in the unfinished hotel, she's living in an actually pretty nice apartment with her family and with another family, but has no school. When I talked to her, was not in school, did not know what she would do with her life, did not know what would become of her and her family. Imagine trying to live with that and keep your head straight. Very, very difficult, very challenging. And the other challenging aspect that I want to get to, I want to be careful about our time. Oh, so we have lots of time. Well, let me just stop before I move to another section then and just ask you if you have questions. I'm happy to, anything that I didn't explain well or that you'd like to hear more about. Yes?
This is a general question because you're traveling through all these places, all these different cultures.
Yeah.
There's a lot of languages. Are you using a translator for these conversations?
Yeah, Nora actually knew a little bit of, and let me go back for you. Nora actually knew a little bit of English, but yes, I had a translator with me too, and it actually gets pretty comical, if I can say that, because in Iraq you have Kurds speak Kurdish. Everyone else speaks Arabic. Most Kurds know some Arabic, if not a lot. Yazidis speak Shingali. That was new to me. That's like their whole own thing that not many other people speak. And most of them do have a second language, but if they are, somewhat unschooled, that might be the only language that they know. I went to a Bible study in the Netherlands a week or so ago, and there were Assyrian Christians from Iraq there, Assyrians from Turkey, some Dutch people, some Belgian people, and we had at one point we had Flemish. I'm trying to remember. We had Kurdish being translated into Arabic so that it could be translated into Flemish so that it could be translated into English. So yeah, that's a real challenge. But yeah, always a translator, and always. I don't travel alone, but I'm usually traveling with locals. Yes, in the way back.
What are some of the things that stop the U.S. from going into parts where ISIS is?
Parts where ISIS is right now? Okay, so we're going to spend the whole rest of the day talking about that question. No, but it is a great question. And, I was going to get to that. I mean, let's save that and talk about that here in the second part that we're going to, because I think that the reasons are deeply embedded in our secular worldview. And I want to say that, the thing that I have learned up to this point where I've brought you, and in the course of my talking with people at the ground level and up in the office, official, government level, this tremendous misunderstanding of what religion is and the power that religion has over people, the power that Islam has had to motivate the kinds of atrocities that we've seen. Even this week, and this is what brings me, I'm going to plunge right in and we'll come back to some more questions, be thinking about what those are. Even this week, when Pope Francis spoke in Poland, and he made this astonishing statement, after everything that we've seen, after talking about these 4 waves of terrorism, talking about how highly organized and driven by philosophy, by religion, Islamic State is, ISIS is, he said, I'm not speaking of a war of religions. Religions don't want war. Do you believe that? It just is not even, and he went on to basically make the case, which you've heard made here in the United States, that that Islamic jihadists are disenfranchised people who can't find jobs, and that if we just fix the economy, if we created a level of social justice where people had jobs, and I'm not saying those things aren't important, but that would somehow deal with this problem. And I think that what I have surmised, the lack of it gets to the failure of the United States and our allies to respond to this crisis. And now we're seeing it, if we deceived ourselves into thinking that it would stay in Iraq and Syria and that it was our problem, we're seeing that that's not the case, right? And one of the reasons that we think that it is particular to a certain kind of people or a certain kind of economy, and it really is it's a very false structure of life and structure of reality, because people are motivated by their deepest beliefs, and many of those deepest beliefs are religious beliefs, and there is an incident that I recount in the book where, and I'm trying to remember when this took place, a NATO advisor recounted it to me. He was sitting in a meeting around a table, and some of the important key generals who were fighting the war in Iraq with headquarters, they were at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and they were having this discussion. And he raised the question, because he himself is a Christian and is from the Middle East. He said, this was around 2007 or 2008. He said, if the Islamic militants come in to wipe out the Christians in Iraq, will NATO respond? And he said there was a long pause in the room. And then around the room, the guys were kind of looking down, and they just all kind of pursed their lips and shook their heads and said no. And that was a really important moment. You've had in the United States a lot of human rights groups and a lot of Christian advocacy groups you might be familiar with, like Open Doors, International Christian Concern. What are some others? There are a number of them. Who were, talking about the Christians are being targeted, they're being killed, they're being forced out of their homes, they're not able to go back, that kind of thing. And to say to those groups, will you realize that the military, even our own military, is not going to protect them? Even though we have 150,000 people, it is not going to be our goal to protect them, because that would be admitting that it was a sectarian war. That would be acknowledging that this was a war with religious dimensions. And to this day, I think the United States has a policy the Obama administration and the Pentagon and the State Department are very committed to treating this as a non-sectarian war. The problem with that, obviously there are many problems with it. The problem, though, I would say it creates a double-edged blowback. That's a bad choice of words. It is a double-edged problem, and it is this. It is that on the one hand, it means that we will not protect the ethnic and religious diversity of a country. We are content to see it become an Islamic republic. And we know as Christians, and it's not simply because we are Christians, not because we're advocating for Christians, we know that this is the truth that God made us to live with the other. He made us to live with those of different He has given us a gospel that is meant to go out to every tongue and tribe and nation. And the whole idea that we would be content with creating monolithic cultures is something that I think ought to is a real problem for us as those who believe in Scripture and believe the truth of the Bible. But the other problem is that it means if we won't protect Christians, we won't protect any group ultimately. We won't protect Muslims. We won't protect Yazidis. And we're seeing that happen. If you remember in 2014 when this crisis began to explode, it came to a very dramatic moment. In fact, I was told by a Kurdish official, ISIS was within 5 miles of Erbil, the capital of Afghanistan, a capital of Kurdistan, sorry. Jet lag. ISIS was within 5 miles of the capital in Kurdistan. There's a U.S. consulate there, all of the Kurdish government, and all of the displaced, in fact, all the government, the entire government of Mosul was living in this area by this time. So you had all of these government officials congregate in this area, and this, one Kurdish official told me they started shredding documents. They did not think anybody anywhere in the world was coming to their aid, and they did not think, and they didn't trust their own forces to be able to withstand ISIS coming in and literally taking over that whole portion that we saw in the green. And they were in communication with the U.S. consulate. We know what happened now. We saw in the United States, President Obama went on national television and made a statement that we were going to protect these people. And I think I have this here, what he said. So overnight, there was this very dire threat. And it's interesting how Christians responded. I go into some detail about that in the book, which I'm going to leave you in suspense about. President Obama came on TV in the evening in the White House state dining room, and he said, "We have chilling reports of ISIS militants rounding up families, conducting mass executions, and enslaving Yazidi women." This is August 7th, 2014. He ordered airdrops he had redirected American C-17s and C-130s to the area, the Sinjar area I mentioned, where the Yazidis were fleeing and where they were being massacred, along with Iraqi army helicopters to airdrop supplies into these areas to help an estimated 8,000 to 50,000 Yazidis. We now know it was several 100,000 who were in danger. He warned, this is what he said that night, the systematic destruction of the entire Yazidi people would constitute genocide. These innocent families are faced with a horrible choice: descend the mountain and be slaughtered, or stay and slowly die of thirst and hunger. So there was then this, over the next few days, you saw this pretty, in fact, one reporter described it as the most chaotic humanitarian intervention they'd ever seen. Airdrop of supplies onto this mountain where the Yazidis had escaped to, and they were trapped there. But did you know that today, August 2016, there are 10,000 Yazidis still living on that mountain? And we aren't talking about them. And I think that it has to come down to some level of failure of the international community, maybe of the I personally think the United States itself, because we helped to create conditions for the destabilizing of Iraq and for the situation that has allowed these successive waves of terrorism to take root. So I can't explain, I mean, that's my attempt, I would say, at explaining why there hasn't been more intervention. I do think that there's a real philosophical battle that's going on here, and I saw it played out in Europe. One of the things I heard people say in Europe over and over again, talking to people who are working with governments to help resettle refugees and talking to churches that are trying to figure out ways to minister, and a number of them said to me, well, you know, we have to convert the Christians first. And what they meant is that this is an issue that we aren't very well equipped to deal with in the West, that we haven't really perhaps, because of our affluence, because of many choices that life presents us, both in Europe and here, we haven't had to deal with this kind of crisis, this level of mass displacement. And we aren't, and when leaders are saying things like this that don't really describe the crisis, then we're left a little bit helpless. Here is what, I mean, in contrast to the Pope's statements this past week, here is what was quoted in Dabiq, which is a regular magazine. You can find it online. The Claremont Institute regularly publishes it online, and it is fascinating. If you have time to read it, it's a glossy magazine. It is distributed widely and put up on the web in a downloadable format. And this is a recent quote from it. The noble Quran appoints the Muslims as guardians over humanity. We have come to the conclusion it is our duty to establish sovereignty over the world and to guide all of humanity to the sound precepts of Islam and its teaching. I say this not to be hyperbolic, not to exaggerate. I say it because I believe it's true. I think that we should take ISIS at its word. You will see stories about how ISIS is on its heels. One I saw this week about how oil revenue, which, ISIS revenue has been running at about $2 billion a year over the last 2 years, that they're taking in from oil revenue, from kidnappings, and from other forms of extortion. These jizya taxes. One guy in Syria who decided to stay on and live in one of the towns captured by ISIS, he initially was going to be charged, I think it was $250, it might have been $350 a month. That was going to be his tax for living as a Christian in a city controlled by ISIS. And within 6 months, it went up to $1,200 a month, and he could no longer pay it. And when he actually talked to reporters, I didn't talk to him, but I saw a number of reports and talked to a couple of people who know this area. He described living there in his house next door to a church and hearing beheadings, and every night, there was a courtyard between his window and where the church was, and people were being imprisoned, and we've heard this story after story. Thousands of people who are in this. What I think we will come to find is like something like the Soviet Gulag, this sort of chain of prisons that run from Raqqa in northern Syria down to Baghdad, and especially using churches to do this. We know in Mosul, a number of ancient churches have been taken over as brothels and as prisons. And so he was describing the sounds that he would hear every night, and it became unbearable. And he made a really dramatic escape up to the Turkish border that's now being fought over with ISIS as well. So, other questions? Yes?
What has been, I guess, your stance or your opinion on Russia's fight with ISIS from the north? Have you had any involvement in that area?
Well, I think, first of all, that Russia being able to take such a dominant role is a direct result of the U.S. stepping back from its role there. And we have this really tricky situation now. I mean, you go back to a really important moment in this fight was in 2013, I believe. It might have been 2012 because I think Hillary Clinton was still Secretary of State. You remember President Obama's red line, where he made this statement not once, but I think 3 times, that if forces in Syria were using chemical weapons, and that were documented, that would be a red line over, and essentially saying that the United States would take military action if that happened. And I want to back up from that and say that, this argument in the States, well, do we really want to get involved for another decade in the Middle East? And that's a very fair question. But I think, and I really want to encourage you guys to be precise in your thinking and to be rigorous in your thinking. Taking military action somewhere does not mean sending 250,000 or 500,000 troops. We have a great, great army, and it is very well equipped and well trained at all levels. And we're seeing now our special forces have done amazing work capturing some ISIS figures and things like that. There are many things that we can do that are short of sending 500,000 people to fight a war in a country that's not ours. And so when we say military action, I think the failure of the United States to take military action opened a door for Russia to come in. Russia is not a strong military force, but they are getting stronger. And they are, because Vladimir Putin is putting a lot of resources that should be going to other things into that right now. The problem, as we get into this, is that, to my way of thinking, our policy in over Syria is pretty much the opposite of our policy in Iraq. I mean, it is clear that our support for rebels in Syria and for taking down the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is helping to aid ISIS and its affiliated groups, which in Syria would be al-Nusra Front, and there's several other al-Qaeda-like groups. So in Syria, you have both third wave and fourth wave of jihadists who are fighting the government there. We have tried to support groups that would be like third wave, but that bleeds over into us supporting ISIS in effect. We know that some of the weapons that we have supplied in Syria have gotten into the hands of ISIS. So it is, and this policy cuts across Republicans and Democrats, because Republicans have supported this policy of taking out Bashar Assad. I really just, my own opinion is that that's a policy that has gotten us into trouble. And that the whole idea of saying we want to depose somebody, I mean, we are wreaking the havoc of that. And I'm not, to say that is not saying that Bashar al-Assad is a good guy or that maybe even belongs in power, but to support rebels while at the same time trying to oppose rebels in Iraq has put us in just a terrible, impossible pretzel. And I think that it has given this opening. Russia's not interested in being philosophically consistent. And so they'll support whoever is supporting them, but that's not typically how the American military and foreign policy has been projected. It gets pretty confusing, so I don't want to confuse things more. Here, just kind of moving forward to this situation as it is somewhat right now. This was last year, but it still is. This was from March of 2015. I was standing with this guy on top of a church. This was in a village that had been called Bakofa. This is in this Nineveh Plain area, this vast area that has now been emptied of Christians, emptied of Muslims, emptied of Yazidis. This is one of the few villages north of Mosul that have been, or north and east of Mosul, that have been retaken by Kurdish forces. And so they are, they're not in ISIS hands, but they're not safe enough for people to return to live there. And so they're completely empty villages, very eerie. And if you look out there, do you see that area where you can see that dirt's being cut up, that line? Yeah. That's ISIS. In fact, I just forgot if I brought it. Purse, please. Thanks. My phone's in here. They were listening to ISIS on shortwave radio, and I remembered this morning that I had the recording on my phone. Don't you love modern technology? I'm going to put it up to here, and hopefully you can hear it. This is a recording of ISIS picked up on shortwave radio while we were staying on top of this. I'm going to play it one more time because I want you to listen. They're calling out to each other. Their call names for each other are Bin Laden and Taliban. So listen again a little carefully, and they're just calling out to each other to try to figure out where they are. You can hear the birds chirping in the background. Kind of surreal. But all of that to say that's how close they were, is that we were standing right there, they're out there, and in fact, through binoculars, you could see the black flags you see some of those white places, and there were black flags flying. And that would be, this church would be about 10 miles from Mosul. So between Mosul and halfway out, ISIS was digging this whole trench around, or hoping to dig a trench around the city of Mosul. Just hoping, it seems kind of throwback, but hoping to stop. They had planted mortars inside those trenches. In fact, this area came under fire about a week after I was there. And one of the things that, the U.S. is doing, our airstrikes are getting a little more precise and strategic. And whereas we came in and we just kind of bombed all these villages where ISIS had taken over, and we did a lot of destruction, I won't question maybe that's what was needed to get them to pull back from some of these areas. But now they actually are cooperating with some of the Kurdish forces and other militias. They have people on the ground who can call in strikes. So when this area came under fire a week later, they also had a sniper embedded with this unit, and they were calling in strikes, and they took out the two guys who were manning the mortars. And they haven't had problems that I'm aware of in that specific area since. But all just to say that this is how close the fight can be, and that ISIS is very determined to hold their ground. And so I think, the rumors are that there's going to be a major offensive by the Iraqi army. A lot of people think it will be before the summer's out. We're getting pretty close. Question as to whether it will be before the election happens. There's that whole October surprise thing that we always look for, where a president, I thought somebody was going to ask a question or make a comment, where our sitting president wants to do something to, kind of establish his legacy, or wants to, clear things up for the next incoming president. And maybe this could be part of President Obama's October surprise, a successful retaking of the city of Mosul from ISIS. That would be pretty dramatic. But all of the military thinkers and strategists say it's going to be very difficult. And I take you back to what we talked about at the beginning. When the Iraqi army went in a few weeks ago and did successfully oust ISIS from the city of Fallujah, the UN was saying there are 50,000 people there who are in desperate need of food. And actually then they upgraded that to they're actually starving. And then they said there's 60,000. And then, I mean, this was happening over a course of hours. And then they said, no, there are actually 90,000 people. Well, Mosul used to be a city of 2 million. And so to try to think about, there's no clear idea of how many people are living there right now and what conditions they've been living in, whether they're whispering, whether they're starving. There are a lot of conjectures, but I don't think we really know the full scope. And so it will be a massive undertaking. We don't have a clear view. I don't think this president will give us one ahead of time of how involved the United States would be in it. But I want to end a little bit to allow for some questions. And I also don't want to end on just a bad note. I want to come back because I think coming off of hearing the stories of people who have fled all the way to Europe because of this threat, and really I've seen a level, hearing the stories in places like Brussels, Ghent, Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Greece, on some of the islands where the reception camps are, and they're still coming. The day I was there on the island of Lesbos, 104 people came that day, and they came in these rafts that we've seen on television, and they came in really awful conditions. Getting into a boat in the middle of the night with your family, handing your baby off to someone is not something you do unless you're desperate. Some of these families paying $10,000 to do that, not something you do unless you're desperate. And hearing their stories of desperation, they're very wide open to the kindness of Christians, to the kindness of people in the West. They're very wide open to talking about what ISIS has done and how they don't want to be part of that. It's a wonderful open door. And I want to leave with that instead of leaving with just the bad stuff. It is, I think, a war that we have underestimated. And there's a little recap of some of the numbers that we discussed, culminating, I think, in something that will be, we'll see what our election does and what our leaders do, but I think that I kind of hope that some of these refugees are going to make it to the United States. I go back to what I said about those who are persecuted are also very persevering. And I think that they have a lot to teach us. And I think, I went to a service and this is where I'll kind of looping around on this point of where Islam is right now in the wake of ISIS. Nabil Qureshi, if you're interested in exploring these topics a little bit more, I highly recommend his books. He is a Muslim who converted to Christianity. He speaks widely, works with the Ravi Zacharias ministry, but has a new book that's just out and he's kind of feverish, I think, on this whole topic right now. Also this year published a book called Answering Jihad, which I think is just an excellent book because he doesn't apologize. You see here, these are 3 of his points that I thought were so important. You always hear this question, this is Islam going through its own reformation, and the whole question, does Islam need a reformation? Well, radical Islam is the reformation because the Islamic State groups are tapping into some of the first and foundational documents and teachings of the Quran and building violent regimes out of it. And so what do we do with that is, I think, a great question as Christians. And I come back just to this picture, this whole diversity of Iraq being emptied. And I want to leave you with the image of them kind of walking toward us walking our way in one form or another, whether they stop in Athens, whether they stop in Berlin, whether they come on to the United States. I know we could spend a whole lot of time talking about the pluses and minuses of our immigration, our refugee policy, which is different from our immigration policy, and what sort of vetting we do, because obviously we don't want to take in terrorists. But I think we have to recognize that 1.3 million new refugees in Europe, yes, it is an opportunity for jihadists to come in, but we've seen in this country that jihadists can come in. They don't need a refugee crisis to do it. And so what we do with the rest of them is, I think, a real moment for us in the church. Time to stop. Didn't leave much time for questions, but I think we have to stop. Can I take one? Yeah.
Do you think it's really fair to kind of say that all of Islam is built on violence? Because like I know
Mm-hmm.
I know Muslims, and I had Muslims come to my school and talk, and while some of the Quran can be interpreted literally, there's probably more Muslims than not.
Right.
They don't believe in violence.
Right.
Like when the Quran, it says, like, if you harm one of mankind, you're harming all of mankind.
Right. Right.
I don't know,
I think it's
fair to, like, generalize them like that.
well, I think a good question for Muslims that you come in contact with and Muslim friends is to ask if they've read the Quran, and then how deeply they've read the Quran. And this is a story that, and I really direct you to Nabil Qureshi's book, to Answering Jihad, on this. Because, and here's what he says that I think is a key takeaway. I mean, he describes in very positive terms his upbringing as a Muslim in a Muslim family, where he was taught what you're describing, this peaceful view of Islam. But then when he began to study it, he came to this, he says, Muslims who study the I can't say this word, the canonical, Muslims who study the texts of Islam carefully will ultimately be faced with the inescapable conclusion that their foundations are quite violent, which is exactly what happened to me. I fought the conclusion for years, but when the reality became unavoidable, I was faced with a three-pronged fork in the road and had to choose apostasy, apathy, or radicalization. And I think that we can really think seriously in colleges, in workplaces, we're in contact. We don't want to run and try to ghetto ourselves against contact with Muslims in our midst. But I also think we can walk through some of those conversations and address this three-pronged fork in the road of apostasy, and we can relate to that. We live in a secularized society that has apostatized itself away from Christianity. Apathy, which we can relate to that too, our comfort, and many of the Muslims that we would meet in the West also share in that comfort or are seeking that comfort, or radicalization. And radicalization for the Islamists is going to move them toward jihad. Radicalization for a Christian should move us toward sacrifice, toward suffering, toward all of the things that it moved Jesus toward. And so I think that we have some really concrete conversations and answers in those conversations. Thank you for a great question. Yeah. Sorry. That one or this one? The total number of people displaced from Syria is like 6 million. There are some who are still in Syria, obviously, but aren't able to live in their homes. And that is a country of 20 million, pretty significant. And then I think the number I saw last night of Syrian refugees is at 4.5 or 5%, 4.4 or 5 million now. Oh, more than 3,000 Yazidis, forgot to finish that, who we know are in captivity, women and girls that we know are in ISIS captivity. Yes.
What's the number of refugees that have made it to America?
It's very small. You know, Obama set this cap for 20,000 Syrians coming in. And then there was this huge controversy about that, which, you know, came up in the context of this really bizarre election season we've been in. And there was this huge debate, and you had the discussion about a ban on Syrian refugees, which is pretty strong sentiment in the country. I mean, you had a number of governors who actually passed, I don't want to say laws about it because they're not constitutional. States don't really control what refugees come into the United States.
What about them like instituting Sharia law within America?
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem?
I think it could be, and I think it's interesting to talk about talk with communities in Europe. I mean, you definitely. I made myself walk through the Molenbeek neighborhood of Brussels. So interesting because you walk from the train station through Molenbeek to the Grand Place, which is the huge tourist mecca. So you're just seeing this clash of worlds. And you know, some people say that there's already Sharia law in Molenbeek. I think that the problem that comes in, and this is the problem that Europe has gotten into, is when we buy into this idea of non-sectarian. In other words, we're saying that religion is not an issue. And so somehow Sharia law becomes okay because it's their expression of their religion. But it's oppressive, and it goes against existing laws. And so if we in America, if our local communities, and I'd like to think if we have strong functioning local governments, state governments, and obviously federal governments, one of the things that I think is really a problem right now is the loss of power at local and state government levels, because that's where you would stand against a push for Sharia law. I think that is the way in which we have to be on guard, because we've seen this happen in Nigeria. Northern Nigeria has Christian population of about 49 point so many percent and 50 point so many percent Muslims, and yet Muslims have been successful in enacting Sharia law in about 6 now, 10 or 12 states. And once that happens, individual rights go away. So yeah, it's a great danger. You want to stop? He has a question.
Go ahead. Do you still think that ISIS, I know they're taking all this land back in Syria and Iraq and those areas, but do you still feel like they want to go beyond that? Do you still feel like they're in war with the United States and things like that they're a serious threat?
Yes, I do. And I take you back to like magazines like Dabiq. If you read the coverage in those magazines after, say, the Brussels attack, I mean, they did almost a whole issue about the Brussels attack, and they are celebrating their gains in the West. And I think that they see the power of social media. They see the power of video as propaganda, you know, the beheadings, in terms of intimidating us and making the conversation be about what they want it to be about instead of what we want it to be about. And so, yeah, I think that they still believe that they have a real chance at that kind of domination. I'd like to think no, they don't, but I'm surprised that they could move into Iraq and take over a nice sliver of the country, and 2 years later have not been dislodged. I think that has to worry us about our leadership and our political structures. And we'll stop there. And then